we need to consider Nicholas's case in relation to the laws and regulations that apply. Specifically, the ones we're looking at this week are MTSS, the requirement that schools provide multi-tiered systems of support for students, and child find. At this point, if you have not looked at those slides or read those documents, please stop and do so, because this isn't going to make a lot of sense unless you've done that. Let's tackle MTSS requirements first. How have the school, district employees, special education staff, teachers provided MTSS, and how have they not? Well, unfortunately, in Nicholas's case, we don't have a lot of evidence in this case study that they have provided tiered levels of supports. This is where I'm going to dig really deeply into the chapter you read this week, and we're going to talk about those four concepts, those four core concepts of multi-tiered systems of support, which are required in the state of Michigan and pretty much in our nation. First of all, one of the core concepts is that MTSS is a school-wide framework. We have zero evidence for that. We know that Mrs. White has provided what she can inside a general education classroom. We also know that there's a very specific statement in there that Mrs. White is a new teacher. And when she went to the principal, we're not sure the context of that meeting, but it just simply states that she went to the principal for special education referral paperwork. At that time, a school-wide team should have stepped in. I'm giving away the next part a little bit, but we don't have any evidence of a school-wide system or tiered systems of support. The next two concepts kind of go together in that schools are required to provide tiered interventions and supports, and from those do screenings, collect data, and do progress monitoring. So dropping those terms, what that essentially means is that when a student is struggling, we put interventions in place and we collect the data so that we can make some decisions. We know that he's struggling with his behaviors. He's lashing out with his friends, and there's no documented support for that. We know that Mrs. White has implemented some phonics and phonemic awareness activities with him, but we don't have the data. We just know that things aren't getting better. We know that Mrs. White, the teacher, has met with mom, and we also know that she has brought gen ed writing and spelling samples with her to the SST meeting. This very well could be data and some progress reporting for Tier 1, what Mrs. White is doing with all of the students in her gen ed classroom. But what we do know is that the second requirement for interventions when it comes to MTSS is that they are of increasing intensity. That means that we don't just try one thing, call it good, not working, and refer to special ed, that we appropriately scaffold up and down the interventions we're providing to make sure students are successful. So we don't 100% know what's going on. We don't have the data we need there. And also, we're not sure what level of universal instruction is happening in the classroom. Does the teacher use UDL? Are there supports built within the classroom? We're not quite sure. We don't have the data that we need. And we know that screening, that data, and that progress monitoring is a key support function of MTSS. So that's just not there. The last part is team data-based decision-making. That's the fourth core concept for MTSS. We know it's well documented that Mrs. White alone has made the decision that Nicholas needs more support and extra help, and she has decided that means special education. We do not have any evidence of a team. The team is the fourth core support in MTSS, and there has not been any collaboration yet. In fact, Mrs. White is kind of being professionally introduced to the special education teacher at the meeting at which she's hoping to get a referral for special education. We know it's not school-wide. There's not a school-wide evidence of response to intervention. And we also know, what I kind of already stated before, that the principal, when Mrs. White approached him for more help, the principal has not stepped in and activated any kind of team-based decision-making and team-based support for Mrs. White and for Nicholas. we can kind of prove that maybe there's a tier 1 level support there for MTSS with Nicholas. But now we can move on to child find. Child find as it applies to all school children. So be careful as you refer back to the Michigan Department of Education guidance document. That gives very clear subheadings for the students that apply under different parts of the law. But when you look at school-age children and you look at some of the triggers, they're happening in Nicholas's case. We know that there's been a family member with similar struggles who was identified as having a disability. There's a history of academic concerns. There's failure and declining grades. There's signs of behavior concerns. There's been a school personnel request, even though it's kind of inappropriate. There has been a school personnel request for evaluation and referral to special education services, and the parent has agreed to extra help. This is where we're in a little bit of a gray area. When MTSS is in place and a child still continues to struggle, if there is a trigger at signed parent consent, the school may not draw out the evaluation and slow down the evaluation to see if MTSS is working. That's not what has happened here. Number one, we don't have signed consent from mom. We know that she agrees that he's struggling, but we don't have any evidence of MTSS. We know that likely this case is not in compliance with MTSS and not in compliance with child find. The next step would be to find a path forward and to work together as a team to find out what's best for Nicholas. And that's our next part.